All right, there we go. All right, we are beginning to wrap up this series that we began a while back entitled Faithful, Growing a Life That Is Full of Faith. And as we dive into our conversation for this morning, I want to kind of paint a scene for you. Kind of tell you a little bit of a story, too, from my background. As many of you know, I grew up in Central Florida, spent a lot of time outdoors, camping, hiking, that type of thing. And when I was younger, my father and I and my cousins would do several of these trips every summer. We'd go to a national forest, Ocala National Forest, and we would go camping. And we started doing this literally, it was late elementary school for me, all the way through high school. And there was a season where we decided we wanted to get more serious about this camping thing. In fact, we had a title for what we were doing previously. We called it Joy Camping. It was where you put everything in the truck and you just drove to a site and you set things up. But, we felt like, man, we were ready to, and we use this term, to live off our wits. And we wanted to go backpacking. We wanted to get serious. And so one of these trips where we went joy camping, we decided to begin to scout out different places that we could backpack to. And so we were at a location, and we found that there was this more primitive campsite about 10 miles away. And so during one of these joy camping trips, we decided, let's go ahead and hike out there, kind of get a sense of what's there. That way, when we come back about a month and a half later, we kind of know what we're going to do. We know where we're going to stay. And so we woke up that morning. We had breakfast and kind of packed a day pack with kind of lunch and some water. And we began our trek. And we start out on the trail, and there's signs indicating, hey, we're going to stop at a place. It's called Clearwater Lake, which if you know Florida, there is no clear water in Florida. It's just a little less dirty looking. But Clearwater Lake, and we start this hike. And remember, this is Florida. And this is the summer, where it rains every day, and you feel like you're in a rainforest. It's super hot and steamy, and we're walking through an area called pretty much a scrub, meaning it's incredibly dense, so you get no wind. And again, it's Florida, where the sand is everywhere. The whole state is sand. And so you got a 10-mile hike, incredibly hot, walking through thick sugar sand. And as you can imagine, you are getting tired. You are consuming a lot of water. And so we proceed on this hike, and we get a couple hours into it, and we realize we are now out of water, heading to a place that we don't really know what to expect. Sometimes they call campsites literally just a clearing and you put a tent up. And so we have a decision to make. We're out of water, and we're probably 7 or 8 miles into this hike. Do we proceed forward and hope that there's water there, or do we just cut our losses and head back? Do we persist forward and hope that we can find water, or do we turn back? In that kind of experience, right, it kind of felt like a life or death experience for my 12-year-old self, and I'm sure my dad as well. He's like, I got my brother's kids here. That experience is something that many of us walk in the door with today as well. Maybe you've gone hiking or camping like that, but what I'm talking about is our spiritual lives. You see, over the past several weeks, as we talked about growing our faith, you have made steps of faith, walking into the unknown. And you've now reached a point in this journey where you're beginning to get tired. You don't know what the end looks like, and you are debating, do I turn back or do I proceed forward? The tension I want us to wrestle with is, right, do we persist into the unknown where God has led, or do we turn back? As I said, maybe some of you have begun taking some steps of faith, and nothing has seemed to change so far. You have been trying to intentionally lead your family spiritually, but they seem unresponsive. You have begun to extend yourself to others, to that neighbor, to that coworker, and they don't seem to care. You've begun making real sacrifices of your time and your energy and your finances, and things are only getting tighter. And you've been, again, extending yourself in such a way, and it feels like life is just getting more difficult. And so you're asking the question, Do I turn back to what I know, or do I continue to persist forward? Because the cost, the opposition, and the lack of obvious fulfillment are incredibly discouraging. And we've all experienced that before. And again, maybe you've walked in the door today where you've been trying to grow, and you just want to turn back. You want to give up. You want to admit defeat. Because what you're doing doesn't feel like it's working. And you feel hopeless. So that's kind of the tension I want us to wrestle with today. This is where the text takes us in Abraham's journey. Because when you're hopeless, what naturally occurs is a lack of vision. You're walking into the unknown, a place you have not been before. And so it's hard to imagine what that end result will look like. The tendency is to turn back. So, the question I want us to wrestle with today is this. What items keep us from persisting in our faith? Right? We're called to grow this life that is full of faith, but there are certain obstacles that make it challenging, right? What items keep us from persisting in our faith? So if you have your Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 22. We're going to pick back up where we left off last week. Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 20, and we'll go from there all the way through chapter 23. And we're, again, asking that question, right? What items keep us from persisting in our faith? Well, item number one, and you could begin filling in the blanks for your notes. Item number one are impossible odds. You see, as we look at Abraham's story, Abraham, he faced some impossible odds as well. And I won't summarize his entire life story. We spent some time doing that over the past several weeks, but just to kind of catch you up, Abraham was this individual that was introduced to us a number of chapters ago, in fact, in chapter 11, and God called this man out. He said, hey, Abraham, I have some important things for you to do. I have some promises for you. If you will leave your homeland, leave what you know, and you follow my words, you follow what I'm calling you to do, I am going to give you many, many descendants. In fact, you're going to be a nation at some point. I am going to give you a land in which to dwell, and I am going to use you to bless all of humanity. Those are some pretty big promises that God gave Abraham. And as we walk through his faith journey so far, what we see is this man, Abraham, really faced some impossible odds. And he struggles with his faith journey, just like we all do. Many times he's taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. And last week, the narrative we looked at was this pretty common narrative that maybe you've seen or heard growing up in church, where God called Abraham to sacrifice his son. And like we said, that was a test. Would Abraham put the gifts of God above the giver of those gifts? Would he value his son over God? And Abraham passed that test with flying colors. And so we finish up that part in Abraham's story, and we step into this next section where we begin to see him exit the scene, where the next generation is about to take over. And leaving that scene from last week where Abraham fully commits, he's all in, it leaves us kind of asking the question as an audience. How is God going to reward that commitment and that sacrifice that Abraham was willing to make? Like I said, Abraham is all in. Is God going to reward him? Is he going to bless him? Because right now, really throughout most of Abraham's life, it seems like God's been pretty absent. And for us, when God feels absent, we lose hope. So what keeps us from persisting in our faith? Impossible odds. Before we look at chapter 20, before we look at chapter 22, starting in verse 20, when I think of impossible odds, I think of this scene from a movie I've always enjoyed, Dumb and Dumber. Some of you guys have seen it. And I think of this scene where the individual named Harry, he finds this girl he really likes named Mary, and he asks her the question, what are the chances of a guy like me and a girl like you ending up together? Some of you guys can maybe finish this. And she tells him, it's not good, man. And he says, not good like 1 in 100? And she says, I'd say more like 1 in 1,000,000. And at that point, you would expect him to realize there's no hope here. But because, again, the title of the movie, he's not the sharpest tool, he says, so you're saying there's a chance. He's incredibly optimistic about his chances with that girl. He is optimistic against impossible odds. And this is what the author wants us to see in Genesis as he is transitioning from the portion of the narrative talking about the test with Abraham to this next section, to let us know that Abraham isn't facing impossible odds. It's there to let us know that Abraham, again, is facing impossible odds. And he is actually optimistic about it as well. Look with me now, Genesis chapter 22, verse 20 to 22. Right after the scene with Abraham and Isaac and the test, this is where we transition to. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham, and I am going to butcher most of these names, so we're just going to roll with it. Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Chemiel the father of Aram, Shezed, Hazo, Pildash, Jiblath, and Bethuel. Now skip down to verse 24. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Ramorah, bore Tebeth, Jehem, Tahash, and Makkah. All right, kind of a weird scene and really weird names as well. Why is that there? We get this weird scene from after the test to getting some genealogy on Abraham's brother. He gets news his brother, Nahor, has 12 sons. Why is that in the text? Why does it matter? What does the author want us to see here? It's meant to contrast his brother, who has 12 sons, with Abraham, who at this point has 2. His brother has 12 kids. His line is likely to move forward, and Abraham has 2. He has Ishmael at this point and Isaac. And as we know, God said, the promises I have for you, Abraham, they're only going through Isaac. So Abraham is facing impossible odds. A lot, you could say, is left up to chance. He only has one descendant on which to pass on this promise, to see this promise of many descendants fulfilled. And I'm telling you what, mathematically, he's off to a bad start. Like, I am not a mathematician, but 1 times 1, or 1 plus 1, or 1 descendant per generation, that is not a great math solution to build a nation. The odds of that promise being fulfilled are nearly impossible. And this is what the author wants us to see. Abraham is going against all odds, but he's willing to trust God's promise. Remember, Abraham at this point, he is all in. And he's willing to trust God's promise despite the odds. And again, it leaves us as an audience wondering, is this the way you build a nation, God? This 1 plus 1 math formula? Man, that does not seem like a good way to do it. And this is the tension the author wants us to wrestle with. These impossible odds that Abraham is facing, yet he continues to persist and trust God. And for us, as we try to grow in our faith, what items keep us from growing in our faith? Impossible odds do. As you have made steps, hopefully in the past several weeks, to grow and to challenge and to stretch yourself, maybe you've asked yourself the question, is this really the place I need to be spending my energy? God, I have been pouring out my heart over the past several weeks with this prayer request that quite frankly feels impossible. And I'm tired. It doesn't seem like he's listening. I need you to work. Maybe God's been wrestling with you about a certain ministry or a certain move in your life, and it just feels impossible, and you're wondering, is this the place I need to be spending my energy? You're moving against impossible odds. And what we see Abraham do is he fully trusts God. He persists in his faith. So we have this little scene between the test with Abraham and Isaac, and then in chapter 22, we transition once again. And again, the author's doing something with these transitions. He's building a narrative. He has an agenda. So look at the first two verses of Genesis chapter 23. We'll catch up here. Sarah lives right to the ripe old age of 127 years. That's what the text tells us. And these were the years of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiritha Aberah, that is Hebron, and the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So the narrative has transitioned. We hear about all the kids that Abraham's brother has, and we wrestle with the tension that Abraham only has one, and now Sarah is dead, right? So, man, we got to make this one kid happen, right? Something's got to happen here with Isaac. But Sarah dies. And you would expect, as the narrative starts out in chapter 23, the focus is centered upon Sarah and this burial process. But there's more going on behind the scenes here. See, Sarah dies, and the text tells us Abraham goes through the normal mourning process over her death, and the next process, just like for us, is we got to do something with the body, right? We need to bury it, or however they want to get rid of the body. They want to honor her. And so the question naturally arises, where will they bury her? Now remember, Abraham has deep roots back in his homeland, in the land of Ur. Would he go back and bury his wife there? Or would he stay in the land that God promised to him and to his family? And what we see in this text is Abraham, he is all in. He is committed to this promise. And so because Abraham is committed to this promise, committed to staying in the land, right? This is the same individual who ran out of the land because of a famine, is now willing to stay there because this is the land God promised him and his descendants. And now, though, if he's going to stay there, he's got to figure out where he buries Sarah. So there's some other people living in the land, and Abraham is just a foreigner. He's just kind of sojourning through the land. That's what the text tells us. And so he asked the people who reside in that land, the Hittites, for a place to bury Sarah. And just for kind of context, these aren't the Hittites that show up later in Scripture. Theologians argue about where they're from, if they have some connection. But we're going to call them the Hittites for today. And so he asked them for a place to bury Sarah because, again, he wants to stay in the land. He wants to persist. Genesis chapter 23, verse 3 through 4, we see this exchange. And Abraham rose up before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. So he asked for a place to bury Sarah in the land. And then there's a series of exchanges that take place, and eventually an individual kind of rises up out of the crowd, or I should say is called out, named Ephron. And he offers Abraham a place to bury Sarah. Look at verse 10 through 11 of chapter 23. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites of all who went in at the city gate. Right? Notice this is a very public transaction that's taken place. He said, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. So this man, Ephron, rises up from the crowd, and he says, Hey, I know, Abraham, you've been looking at my caves over there, and that's where you want to bury Sarah, and you're just asking for a place to bury her, but you know what? I will give you the field that it's connected with as well. And on the surface, this seems pretty generous. Right, man, this individual, right, they respect Abraham. They want to give him a place to bury his wife. It seems pretty generous, but if you were to rewind, Abraham at this point, he's only asking for caves. Possibly because they had no real value. And so this man throws his field on the transaction as well. Maybe to discourage Abraham. Maybe, as we see take place, he can add more value to this property. So he proceeds to effectively sell the property to Abraham. Look at verse 13 through 15 of chapter 23. And he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? go bury your dead. And again, we read this in 2024, and 400 shekels of silver means nothing to us, right? We don't know that value. What we see in this exchange is Abraham offers to pay full price for not only the caves, but the field that is connected with it. And I really think it's because that way no one can come back later and accuse him of just taking it or undermining the situation. But again, we read this text, and Ephron says, hey, you can buy it for 400 shekels. And again, that means nothing to us. But I did not find a single theologian that said that would not say that Abraham grossly overpaid for this land. In fact, many went as far to say he was extorted. He was taken advantage of. Ephron knew he was a grieving man who wanted to stay in the land, and so he offers Abraham this land for an insane amount of money. He is literally extorted. Right? If this was America, he'd probably go to jail, okay, for offering such a stupid amount of money for a small little piece of land. And so Abraham purchases it for an insane amount of money. And again, we read this text, we say, hey, wasn't this land promised to Abraham? Why is he overpaying for this tiny piece of property? Is this really the way to gain land? And again, what we see in the text is Abraham is committed to the promise, and he's willing to even pay an insane amount of money for a small piece of land just to get a foothold. And so, what items keep us from persisting in our faith? Abraham was facing impossible cost. That's your next point as well. Impossible cost can sometimes keep us from persisting in our faith. And as we have made steps, hopefully in the past several weeks, to grow and to stretch ourselves, maybe you found yourself asking the question, is this really the place I need to be spending my money? Maybe God has laid it on your heart to raise money for a certain project or ministry. And you tell yourself, now at this stage, man, that is an impossible goal. I can never raise enough money for that project. Will you persist or will you go back? Maybe you come to the conviction that you need to be giving more frequently of your finances to this church and to different missions projects. And now you're at the stage and you're hit with the reality that, man, I don't know if I can commit even 5% of my income, let alone 10% of my income to the church. You're facing impossible cost. Maybe God is moving you to switch careers where you take a cut in pay and now you're saying, I could never do that because I'm faced with an impossible cost and I don't want to persist forward into the unknown. So as we want to grow in our faith, what keeps us from persisting in it? Impossible odds, impossible cost, and here's your next blank, impossible people. So throughout this exchange, if you kind of read it on the surface, again, it would seem like the Hittites were very hospitable to Abraham. But going on below the surface, as you look at some of the cultural norms and actually kind of begin to reread it and read it and read it over and over again, you realize that there is an inherent lack of trust between these two parties, between Abraham and the Hittites. In fact, Abraham acknowledges as much as he differentiates himself from these people. Look again in verse 4 of chapter 23. As he goes to them, he says, I am a sojourner and a foreigner. He's acknowledging that he is not ethnically one of them, and he even uses the language, I want to bury my dead. It's not our dead, it's mine. This is my wife. We aren't one of you, we're just here. So there's an inherent lack of trust. But again, when Abraham approaches them about burying Sarah, take a look at this exchange that takes place in verse 5 through 6. Think of kind of a crowd or a group of people he's approaching here. Verse 5 and 6, he says this, the Hittites answered him, right? He asked them, I need a place to bury Sarah? They said, hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. And again, on the surface, man, that seems incredibly gracious. They're letting them say, they're pretty much saying, Abraham, take your pick. Where do you want to bury Sarah? Any part, any of our tombs, they're open to you. But again, they're saying, none of us will withhold from you, i.e., I hope he doesn't choose mine, right? No one is raising their hand and saying, Abraham, you can take my tomb. In fact, even when Ephron emerges from this conversation, it's Abraham that calls him out and said, hey, can you guys go to Ephron? I like where that's at. It's one of those things saying, hey, you are welcome to anything, but don't ask me for help. Again, there's an inherent lack of trust. And again, as you read through this, as you understand some of the customs during this day, even if he were to bury Sarah on Hittite land, her body would not be there long term. After she fully decomposed, they would have eventually moved her bones and her bodies and her bones and what was left of her, and they would have moved her somewhere else. It was not a permanent place. And Abraham knew that, and even the Hittites knew that as well. And I just love, again, if you look back at verse 8 and 9, in this exchange, when they say, hey, you're welcome to the choicest tomb among us, no one raised their hand and said, you can have my spot. In fact, Abram has to call out Ephron. He didn't step out, he got called out, and he used this opportunity to extort Abraham, to get an insane amount of money for a tiny little piece of land, profiting off a grieving and desperate man. And even the author goes through and details how the money is counted out. There is a lack of trust between Abraham and these impossible people. Look at verse 16 of chapter 23. Abraham listened to Ephron, right? The amount of money I owe you. And Abraham weighed out for him the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. Right? There is a very intentional transaction that takes place. There is a lack of trust between these parties. And so this formal transaction takes place, and all the details are there. It's public. There's witnesses. It tells us where it took place. It tells us the name of the buyer, the name of the seller, the negotiations. And I think a lot of this is also recorded for us to let us know, in case someone comes back around later, Abraham paid way too much for that land, but it is his legally. And again, as we are reading this text, imagine yourself as a early Hebrew reader, and you're reading about Father Abraham, and you're wondering to yourself, is this really the picture of an important and influential person? Right? Begging for land effectively, being extorted, being taken advantage of? Is this really the picture of what he looks like? And again, Abraham is committed to the promise of the land. He is willing to persist despite the people who currently occupy it. So what keeps us from persisting in our faith? Impossible people. And for you today, as you are seeking to grow in your faith, maybe you have begun to encounter some impossible people as well. And you've asked yourself the question, do I really need to deal with these people? Maybe you've been praying for your spouse. Maybe you have taken a more patient approach, and you just feel like, man, their heart will never change. They are impossible to deal with. Maybe you've been working on a person in your sphere of influence, maybe someone at work or at school, and you've been praying for them. You've been sharing the gospel with them. You've been pouring into their life. And you're at that point where you're just tired and you don't want to persist because you say that person will never respond to the gospel. Or maybe your own kids. You raised them in church and you thought they were committed to following Jesus, and now they've walked away. And you're wondering, do I persist in the faith? Do I really need to deal with these people in this way? So what do we do with this text? What does Abraham model for us? He models a level of persistence, right? Despite the odds, despite the impossible cost, despite the impossible people who occupy the land, he is willing to bet on God. He's willing to bet on the promises God made him. And that's our encouragement for today. As you deal with impossible people, impossible costs, impossible situations and odds, this text calls us to persist in the faith as well. Bet on God. You see, because for Abraham, the odds were actually in his favor. Take a look at Genesis chapter 22, verse 23. This is a neat little addition that the author gives us. Remember that weird little section, the genealogy of Abraham's son? I skipped a verse on purpose because I wanted to come back to this. Genesis 22, verse 23. Remember, this text is there to remind us that Abraham's facing impossible odds when it comes to descendants, but we get this little glimmer of hope that the author and God gives us. It tells us Bethuel fathered Rebekah. And it's probably, sectioned off in your scripture. That is there intentionally. Because as a Hebrew reader, Rebekah comes up. Because as we'll see, Rebekah will eventually be Isaac's wife. So even though Abraham faces impossible odds when it comes to his descendants, this is God's way of saying, hey, against all odds, I have already provided a spouse for Isaac, and I will make a way for this promise to continue. So the odds are in our favor. Right? I've read the end of Scripture, right? We win, right? Jesus wins. The odds were in Abraham's favor, they're in ours as well. As we move on, as you bet on God, what we see in our life and in Abraham's life is the cost were not a consideration for God or even for Abraham. See, Abraham is so committed to that land at this point, he is willing to pay an insane amount of money for a tiny little scrap of it because he believes the promise. And even though, again, he overpaid for this land, God had blessed him with the financial wherewithal to pay that extortion or to pay for that insane amount of money, right? He was extorted. You could bet on God because the odds are in our favor, and money is not a consideration for God if he's calling you to do something. And then finally, we see that God uses people to fulfill his work. See, even the Hittites, even though there was a lack of trust between the Hittites and Abraham, they still willingly gave over a small piece of their land, which proved to be a small taste of what was to come for Abraham's family. And while it wasn't the full promise, Abraham now officially is legally a owner of the land. He has a foothold. And just a couple weeks ago, right, we looked at Abimelech. He's got a well now, and he's got a little bit of land. He's legally a land owner. He's persisting in the faith, trusting the promise. And what's really interesting to note here is the rest of this promise, he doesn't really get to see a whole lot more move forward before his death. He's trusting, he's walking by faith that God will keep this promise to him and ultimately to his descendants. What keeps us from persisting in our faith? Impossible odds, impossible cost, impossible people. But we see in our text that we are called to bet on God. Now, if we died doing that hiking trip out to Clearwater Lake, I wouldn't be here today. But we made a decision at that point. We were committed, and we decided, we are going to continue this hike out to this lake, right? We want to kind of see if this is where we want to set up camp on another trip. And we made it out there, and it was pretty primitive, but there was a hose that we were able to drink out of. Didn't taste great, probably got all kinds of stuff in it, but man, it worked out. We made it there, we got the water, and we went back our next trip. And actually what we did later is we got some other stuff where you could essentially drink out of a mud puddle later on. That became necessary for us. Our persistence paid off. And this text wants us to see Abraham persisting in the faith, trusting God. Even though he might want to run backwards, even though he might question the promise, he is fully committed, and that's what we are called to do as well, to be all in, to bet on God. And so today, if you are struggling to do that, if you're struggling to grow in your faith, to persist in your faith, maybe for you it needs to start small today. Right? What little part of your life today do you need to turn over to him? Maybe it's your pride as you deal with that difficult person. Maybe it's a little bit of your financial income as you learn to trust God. Maybe it's your time as you commit to prayer for different things that God has laid on your heart. Start small and then watch what God does with it. As you continue to walk through Abraham's story, you see the small little step of persistence grow as God expands his family, gives them more and more of the land, and ultimately we see Christ emerge from this family who obviously blessed all of humanity. Persistence is key, and it might not be fulfilled in your timetable, but I'm telling you, if you're struggling today persisting, you can bet on God. Got two questions for you, and we'll finish up. In what area of faith are you ready to give up because you are not seeing the results you expect? And what would it mean for you to practice persistence, even if it doesn't become a reality in your lifetime? Let's close in a word of prayer. God, thank you for this text that you preserved for us and this reminder, quite frankly, of how quick we are to give up, to head back to what we know, because we struggle sometimes to walk into the unknown. But God, Abraham was willing to persist in the faith. He was all in, and God, I pray that we can be all in as well, wherever you might be leading us, to take that next step of faith. And Lord, so I pray for our church as they are seeking to grow closer to you, to look more and more like your Son, that you would give us the courage to persist and to trust you and to follow your guide. Lord, be of us today. Thank you for bringing us together this morning. Thank you for your word. In your name, amen.